As an Indian, from birth, you are raised to respect your parents. You are raised to respect your grandparents, your uncles, your aunts, basically everyone older than you, all of your elders. You are taught from a young age to respect your elders. And, same thing with your parents. In Indian culture, it is very important to respect your parents. But what happens if your parents mistreat you? So, in my situation, my whole life, my entire life, my parents have treated me like dirt. My entire life. They have treated me like just like dirt. And when I was, really young, I noticed that something was wrong. I noticed every once in a while that something didn't seem right in the treatment of me, but it wasn't until I started to get much older that I really felt like I wasn't imagining things. But it took me years. I was an adult by the time I really, really realized that they had been mistreating me my whole life. Even to this day, I'm in my 40s now. Even today, I still have issues. I have problems because of the experiences I've had with my parents. And so, if I was still living in India or if I was living, overseas where the Indian culture would still be pretty intact, I'm not sure how I would have responded to all of this. But, we moved to the US, and in America I no longer really talk to my parents because of the way they've treated me. So I only talk to them if it's absolutely necessary, and I keep the communication very brief because it just they're like so they're just so toxic. I know toxic is a word a lot of people use nowadays, but it is. I mean, they're draining, they're toxic. Every time I interact with them, I'm left in tears. I cry. It takes me several days to feel remotely normal again. But anyway, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some things that they've done over the years. Not everything, because that would just be way too long. The video would be too long. So I'm just going to talk about some of the things that they've done to me over the years, which this is how they treated me my whole life. And what I learned from them, how to not treat my kids. I'm just going to talk about a handful of things about, what not to do with your kids, which might be common sense for a lot of you. But for me, I actually had to learn this because of the way that I was treated. So, one of the things they always did, they always, always, always played favorites. Always. Ever since I was a kid. Between me and my brother, they very obviously favored my brother. I mean, very obviously favored my brother. But it doesn't end there. They also favor everyone else, also, like everybody else over me. All of my cousins, all of their friends, all of my parents' friends, all of my friends, everybody else prefer over me, which is, I don't know. For whatever reason, they just do not like me. And it has shown in their behavior since I was young, since I was a young child. And I'm sure somebody's going to say, oh, well, it's because you're a girl and your brother is a boy, and that's why they favor him. And I'm sure someone is going to say that. But I just want to point out that in my cousins, 50% of my cousins are girls and 50% of my cousins are boys. And my parents prefer all of them. Like, they have no problem with my female cousins. They think, they have no problem with my female cousins, and the way they talk to my female cousins and they interact with them a lot better than they interact with me. They're friendlier with my cousins, they're nicer to them, they talk to them like they're friends. But with me, it has never been like that. They have always put everybody else above me, and I was literally always on the bottom, and I still am. It's still like that. It doesn't matter who the person is, that person is always placed above me. My entire life, I've been treated like this. Everybody else was always more important than me. And it is still like that to this day. I have no idea why they treat me like that, but it's been like that my whole life. So I don't think it's necessarily because my brother is a boy and I'm a girl. I think is something else beyond that. You know what I mean? Like, maybe that's part of it, but I think there's more to it, but I don't know what the thing is, because if it was just a thing about girls and boys, then they would also not like other girls, and that's not the case at all. They love a lot of my female cousins. They love my female cousins, but they do not love me. I don't know. So, of course, one valuable lesson that I learned with this is do not favor your kids. If possible, do not favor your kids. Now, do not show favoritism between your kids. So try to keep things as equal as possible. And that's really hard to do because children are all different. So I've got two kids, and my eldest is very challenging. My oldest child is a very, very challenging child. And my youngest is a lot easier. And so, but I still try to keep as equal as I can between the two of them. It's very hard, but I'm really trying. I'm trying. And I learned because of my parents, my brother could never do anything wrong, and I could never do anything right. So I try really hard. I don't always do a great job, but I'm trying to treat my kids as equally as possible. And then the other thing that my parents always did is they always gave everybody else attention. Everyone else, they always gave them attention. They talked to everybody else. They took people seriously, but they never did that to me. So that's the other thing is, don't give attention to everybody else and ignore only one of your kids. Don't do that. I mean, that's just wrong. It's just wrong. Don't show preferential treatment for everybody else and then ignore one of your kids, which is what my parents did to me my entire life. And they still do it. I don't know why. It makes no sense to me why they've always treated me like I'm the lowest. I mean, like I'm like the least important person. I don't know why. But so don't do that. And so I try to put my family first. To me, my kids are more important to me than someone else's kids. So my kids are more important to me than the neighbors. I don't know, because I obviously don't want to say that other people are not important, because other people are important. Everyone is important. But I don't want to show my kids oh, I think the neighbor is better than you and I think the neighbor is more important than you, because that's not true. All human beings are important, right? But you want to show your kids that they are also very important and that they are not just a piece of dirt, which is how my parents treated me. Treat your children equally. Do not make them feel like they're less than everyone else out there. That's a big thing that I learned. And this is probably going to sound like total common sense to people, but for me, for me, this was like an epiphany, because I don't know. The way I was treated, I was always treated, I was always put last. I was always last. And to this day, I'm still last. And they've treated me like dirt my whole life. So basically, yeah, don't treat your kids like they're dirt. And especially, don't treat one of your kids like they're dirt and treat the other child like they're perfect. Do not do that. Just bad. Bad, bad, bad. Very bad. The other thing that my parents have done constantly, constantly, when my parents have made mistakes and they have made bad choices, they made bad decisions that affected me negatively, it affected me in a bad way, they never admitted it. They never admitted that they had made a bad decision. And they never, ever apologized for anything wrong they did. Never. So if they did something wrong, they never accepted that they were wrong, and they never said, I'm sorry. Never. Never, never, never. To this date, my parents have never fully accepted that they were wrong, that they made bad decisions. They have never said, I'm sorry for my decisions. I'm sorry for the way that, what we did affected you. They have never accepted blame. They have never said, I'm sorry. Never. In fact, they could not even admit that they had done anything wrong at all. So usually what they would do is they would just act like nothing had happened, or they would blame me. And then they would say things like, you're just a child, you don't understand anything, or you're just being too sensitive, or they would tell me that I was wrong, or they would tell me that I was overreacting to something. But they would never admit when they made a mistake or when they were wrong. And it was obvious that they were wrong. There was evidence that they were wrong. They never admitted they were wrong, and they never said, I'm sorry. Never. Never admitted their mistakes, never accepted when they were wrong, never ever apologized to me for anything. And so, I mean, again, I'm not really sure what the issue is, but I think it's like they have such big egos, or maybe their egos are so fragile that they cannot accept that they're wrong. I don't know what it is about them. So, like, either they cannot accept that they're wrong, or I don't know. But so I actually learned that it is super important when you mess up as a parent or as a person, whatever, but especially as a parent to your children, if you mess up, you apologize. And I do that. In fact, I apologize a lot because I make a lot of mistakes. I am not perfect. And because of the life I've had, I'm actually a very imperfect person now because I've had so much like bad things happen to me in my life. I've had a lot of like really traumatizing things happen. And it's really like mentally, it's really messed me up. And so, because of all that stuff, I'm actually not a good parent. But because of all the stuff that's happened to me over my lifetime, um, it's definitely I'm not like as stable as I used to be before all this stuff happened. But so basically, as a person, I'm a very flawed person because of a lot of things that happened to me in my life. I do make mistakes and I do mess up. And when I realize I've made a mistake, when I realize I've messed up, I apologize to my kids immediately. I say, I was wrong. I'm sorry. This is why I was upset. I'm very sorry. And, I was wrong about this. So people like my parents who refuse to admit that they've done anything wrong, refuse to accept any blame, refuse to apologize, like that is a very, very, very small mind. Very, very, very tiny, tiny ego, or I don't know, maybe a big ego. I'm not sure. Whatever their problem is, like that's a problem. If you cannot accept that you've made mistakes, that you've made bad decisions, and if you cannot apologize, that's a big flaw. So I know that I'm not perfect. I think that people who can actually admit that they were wrong and that they understand what they did was wrong and that they can apologize to their children, that's a really good sign. And that's something, again, that I learned because my parents did not do it. And so I realized, this is really important. Like, it's important that you apologize to your kids when you're wrong. It's important to do that. And so, yeah, once I realized I was wrong, because sometimes it takes me like a day to realize I was wrong, I apologized that day when I realized I was wrong. Now, the other thing, too, is I also hug my kids when I apologize to them. And this is important because this kind of goes to the next thing. The other thing that I grew up, again, I thought this was totally normal behavior, right? I thought this was totally normal because I grew up like this. But my parents, my Indian parents, they never hugged me. So as I was growing up, I mean, literally, my parents never hugged me. Never hugged me. And so I actually thought that was normal behavior. And I thought it was just part of Indian culture. I thought it's part of Indian culture to not hug people. I thought it was normal to not hug your children. Like, oh, we shouldn't hug our children. We don't want to show them physical affection because then we're going to spoil our kids. So I honestly believe that that's why my parents never hugged me. And then to not show physical affection. So I thought it was totally normal. And like I said, that is how I grew up. I grew up without hugs and without physical affection from my parents. But then, again, as I was getting older, I noticed that my mother hugged other people. She hugged other people. She hugged my cousins. She hugged my female cousins. Again, as I got older, I was about 30. I was about 30 years old. I was so surprised. My mother hugged my brother like it was completely natural. She hugged him without like no hesitation, no anything. My brother was having some issue. And my mother just like took him in her arms and just gave him this really nice big hug, completely natural. And I was about 30 years old. And I was so shocked when I saw her do that. because she had never done that to me. She had never hugged me like that. I mean, she had never hugged me, period. And there were a few times where she had like physically touched me, but it was very, very few. And it was usually just like on the arm or something. She had never hugged me, especially when I was upset or sad. She had never hugged me. And so my brother was having like this issue, and then she just took him in her arms and hugged him, and it was so natural. And I realized in that moment, again, I was almost 30 at this point. I realized in that moment, the way she did it, she had been hugging him probably this whole time she had been hugging him, but she never did that to me. And my father never hugged me anyway, you know. So it was something interesting because I noticed that my mother hugged my brother. You know, she hugged her friends. She hugged my cousins. She hugged her sisters. She hugged a lot of other people, but she never hugged me. So that's how I grew up without hugging, with no physical affection. So, guess what I do? I try to hug my kids every day. I don't necessarily hug them every single day because sometimes we're just, busy or whatever. But I try to hug my kids every single day, even if it's just for a second. Because, sometimes they're like squirming around and they want to go play and they don't want me to hug them. But like, I still try to like sneak in a hug just to show them a little bit of that physical affection, just to give them a little bit of a hug. Especially my oldest, because like I said, my oldest is definitely challenging. And she's that one person who she just does whatever she wants. And I really have to go out of my way to hug her because she's just always running around. But the younger one is a lot more affectionate. So the younger one will come and hug me. But that's something that I do is I hug my kids. And that's another lesson that I learned is hug your children. Hug them every day. I mean, there's nothing wrong, right? Nothing wrong with hugging your kids. Probably a good thing. I mean, you probably don't want to hug them too much, but maybe if you hug them every day, that, it's probably not a bad thing to do. So another thing that I do is I do hug my kids, and I try to hug them every day. As I mentioned earlier too, we came to the US. I was not born in America. And I did not want to come to America. I was like the only person I knew who did not want to come to America. But I did not like America. I didn't want to come. So anyway, after we came to America, I actually had a lot of problems. The culture shock was horrible. And the culture clash was horrible. And then growing up in my family, where my parents did not support me, they didn't even talk to me. They treated me like I was dirt. They did not support me, right? So I was having a lot of problems. I started to have a lot of problems. So I would have like a lot of mental problems. I started to get very, very, very depressed. I mean, the word depressed, it's used so much. But when you are actually in that depression, it's horrible. It's horrible. So I was having a lot of mental issues, a lot of sadness, a lot of depression. And so I was this stuff started when I was about 11 or 12, and it started to get really bad around 13, 14. It started to get really, really bad. So my parents knew I was suffering. My parents knew I was having problems. They did not help me. In fact, they would go out to parties and they would leave me home alone because I was having these problems. So, here I am, 13, 14 years old, and I'm suffering. I am just suffering. And instead of helping me or taking me to the doctor or getting me any kind of help, my parents would just leave me home alone. And then them and my brother, they would go to parties. Because, they didn't want to stay home with me because I was sad and crying and depressed. They wanted to go out and have fun. And that's what they did. So this happened several times over years. And then they didn't want to take me because, I was having problems, right? I was having problems, so they didn't want to take me with them. They didn't want me to come to the party and ruin the party. They didn't want me to ruin them having a good time. They didn't want their friends to see me acting like that, right? So they literally would leave me home alone. and they would just go to all these parties to spend time with their friends and have fun and just go. And sometimes, like in the beginning, they asked me if I wanted to go, but I was so sad I didn't want to go. And then later on, they never asked me. They just left me home alone when I was sad and depressed. And like they would just leave me home alone, and I would just stay home and I would cry or I would be alone. And then the three of them would go out to the parties. But yeah, and like part of it was because I was just so sad and just there was so much suffering. But when your child is suffering, as a parent, it is your job and your responsibility to help your child and to maybe take care of your child. My parents did not do that. They literally just left me home alone while they went and had fun with their friends. So, yeah. And they just left me home alone to suffer by myself. They did that several times over many years. So, lesson number 4 that I learned from my parents like, if your child is having problems, if your child is having mental problems like anxiety or depression or they're suicidal, which I was, by the way. Like, if your child is suffering and your child is having issues, you might want to help your child instead of just letting them stay home and suffer by themselves for years and years and years while you go out to play and, have fun with your friends and go to parties and take your other child who's not having problems. So basically, the entire time I was suffering, they just ignored me. They just neglected me. They did not help me. And like I said, this continued for several years. And then, later, I started to have even more problems because nobody helped me, right? So I actually started to get more and more out of control. So then instead of me just being sad and depressed, it was like I was starting to skip school. I was getting into drugs. I was drinking. And my parents did not care. Like, they just did not care. And at that point, they really didn't want me around because of my behavior, right? I was starting to act out. I was starting to have bad behavior. And so then they really, like, they did not take me with them anywhere. They just left me home alone. And they would just go with my brother. I mean, they went to so many parties and, had fun. And they would just leave me behind. And that behavior continues to this date. It's been like 20, 30 years. And like, they never helped me. Well, I mean, at some point, they finally decided that enough was enough. But, by then it wasn't help. It was just punishment. But so, again, this is also a very important lesson that I learned from my parents because of what they did not do. So I learned, yeah, if your child is having mental problems, if they are suffering a lot, you should probably help your children. So being selfish and going to parties, don't ignore your child's problems, especially when they're suffering. Do not ignore your child's problems. You want to help your kids instead of just like ignoring them and neglecting them, which is the way I was raised, which is how I grew up. And so that was all years ago when I was a teenager. Those were from the years of like 11 to 17. I was a younger child at that point. But that kind of behavior still goes on today. So I am an adult now. I'm in my 40s. I have never healed. I have never healed from the treatment that I had. To this day, I still suffer. A lot of the stuff that happened. Sorry, getting emotional again. So a lot of the stuff that happened when I was young and what I went through, it damaged me. It's damaged me forever. I cannot get better. I have not been able to get better. So I've seen a lot of counselors. I tried to help myself a lot. But because of what I went through mentally, even today, I'm not okay. Because of what I went through, even today, like I still suffer today. I'm not okay. People can't tell that when they meet me because I'm very good at hiding it. It's very easy to pretend to be normal. But so this kind of treatment of me, though, it still continues. Several years ago, I think I had gone back to my parents' house because somebody was getting married. And it was one of the few times I had been invited. Um, and so, I had gone to my parents' house, because there's always people who think I'm exaggerating, or they think I'm imagining things, or they think I'm making things up. Um, but so when I went to my parents' house, I remember walking around, and they had all these photographs up, and I looked at the photos, and they had photos of their friends. They had photos of my brother, of course. They had several photos of my brother. They had photos of themselves. They had photos of our dog who had died. So a picture of our dead dog was up there. And I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked behind photographs. There were zero photographs of me. Zero. They had zero photographs of me anywhere. They had several of my brother all over the place. They had zero of me, none. And so I thought, okay, because there's always that part of me where I think, I've imagined this, right? I've imagined this. Like, I'm making this up. I mean, there's no way I grew up under these circumstances. But then I saw that and I thought, no, that preference, that preferential treatment, look at that. It's visible here. They have zero photographs of me up. Zero. But my brother, they had at least 6 or 7 photos of my brother, at least. And then they had photos of themselves and their friends and the dead dog. But they had zero of me. So I saw that, and that made me sad again, because, this kind of stuff, it proves to me that what I grew up in my life, it was not imagined. It was real. I didn't imagine this stuff. This stuff actually happened. And then it was the same trip where, we had gone to the wedding, and these people came up to me and they're like, "Who are you? Who are you?" It was an Indian wedding. "Who are you?" And then my father said, "Oh, this is my daughter." And then these women exclaimed, "Daughter? You have a daughter? We didn't know you had a daughter." And apparently, a lot of my parents' friends did not know I existed. They had been friends for 2, 3 years. So for 2, 3 years, they had been friends, and my parents never told them that I existed. It never came up. Never ever told people that I existed. And people were like, and of course they said, "Well, of course it's normal. Why would we, why would they know about you? You're never here. Why would they know about you?" That's a lie. Because I've met people randomly and then they bring up their kids in conversation just in passing. So these people were friends with my parents for 2 or 3 years and nobody knew I existed. So I am so not important. There are no pictures of me up. Nobody even knew that I existed. I was always left out of everything. That kind of stuff is still happening to this day. It's May 2023, and this kind of stuff is still happening to me. So as far as photographs, yeah, make sure if you have 2 or 3 kids that all of their photographs are up, not just one, not just your favorite kid. You might want to put up all your kids' photographs. And then if you have friends who you've been friends with for 2 or 3 years and they don't know that you have a second kid, you might want to tell them that you have a second kid. I mean, it's kind of important to let people know these things, don't you think? So, yeah, it's just crazy the kind of stuff I've grown up with and the way that I was treated. And my parents think there's nothing wrong with it. They think there's nothing wrong with how they treated me. They've never accepted that they treated me badly. They never accepted that what they did was neglect. What they did was severe neglect. I didn't even talk about every single thing that happened. So, that would just be such a long video, and this video is already so long. But anyway, so yeah, so some of the basic things, I'm sure most of you people out there already know to do this, but yeah, so some basic things I learned from my parents. Don't play favorites. And with your kids, don't make the one child seem like they are not important at all and then everybody else is more important than I am, including the plumber. The plumber is more important than your kid. Don't do that. Don't make your child feel that way. Don't ever do that. Yeah, tip number 2, when you mess up, accept that you've made a mistake and apologize to your kid. Always do that. Number 3, hug your children. Show them some good physical affection. If your kid is suffering or needs help, don't ignore them. Don't leave them home alone and go to parties. Help your kid. If your kid is suffering, help your child. Photographs. If you have 2 or 3 kids, make sure everyone's photographs are up. I mean, like, this should be like common sense, right? This should be common sense, right? And yeah, like if you have friends, your friends should probably know that your kids exist. I mean, especially if you've been friends with them for 3 years. If you have friends for 3 years and they don't know that you have a child, or like there's one child who never, they don't know that that child exists, something's probably wrong in that situation. So anyway, these are just some of the things that I've experienced. This happened for years and years and years, these kinds of things. So all I can say though is that my parents got very lucky. They were never caught by the authorities. Um, if they had actually been caught by the authorities, they would have been charged, probably. So, because if the same thing happened now, and if I behaved the way my parents behaved, and my kids were suffering, and I just let them suffer, and I never got them help, and I just left them home alone and basically abandoned them, because my parents basically abandoned me. But like they abandoned me in front of everybody, and nobody cared. So that's essentially what my parents did. They abandoned me in front of everyone in plain sight. Nobody cared. If I did that to my kids right now, they would come arrest me for neglect. They would come arrest me for mental abuse, emotional abuse, whatever. So my parents, everyone thinks they're wonderful people. They got away with it. And they are still going to parties. They're still having a good time. They take my brother with them everywhere. And I am usually left out of everything. And like I said, over the years, I've learned to just cut them out of my life, because whenever I let them into my life, it really leads to a lot of suffering for me. So, I don't know. Anyway, I think the thing that sucks the most is that everybody thinks they're wonderful people, and people who do know about me, they think I'm this horrible person. It's like unfair things when people think you're a terrible person, and everyone thinks your parents are wonderful people, even though they were very abusive and neglectful. Anyway, so thank you so much for listening. This is a long video, so thank you for listening. I hope you guys have a good day, and hopefully we'll see you next time.